Implementation frameworks. It describes relationships among elements of the research and management problem and suggests an order for doing things and may include many elements that, though overlapping, are distinct phases in the process. In a strict sense, an implementation framework is independent of management objectives. But in practice, both management approach and the implementation framework contribute concepts and ways of thinking that guide the choices that are made. In 1995, FAO introduced a general fishery policy and management cycle with nested levels of activity that scale down from international laws and policies to national governance issues to operational management of a fishery. Each level is connected to those above by a series of feedback loops that allow finer scale and faster moving process to be incorporated within the larger and slower levels above. More recently, FAO has promoted a management planning and implementation cycle on 2003 for the implementing the ecosystem approach to fisheries, which unpacks the management and implementation components of the original framework. The implementation cycle recognizes a series of steps in the management process, beginning with a scoping phase and are running through conventional steps of setting objectives, making rules, implementing management, and monitoring and assessing outcomes. Figure 1. The ecosystem approach to fisheries implementation cycle, source FAO 2003. First step is scoping. Fishery and area. Stakeholders, issue identification, down to setting objectives. Broad goals, operational objectives, indicators, and performance measures. Next is the formulating actions and rules, legislations, regulation, and planning, down to implementing and enforcing, monitoring and reporting, short-term assessments, and long-term policy review. Implementation frameworks. It describes relationships among elements of the research and management problem and suggests an order for doing things and may include many elements that, though overlapping, are distinct phases in the process. In a strict sense, an implementation framework is independent of management objectives. But in practice, both management approach and the implementation framework contribute concepts and ways of thinking that guide the choices that are made. In 1995, FAO introduced a general fishery policy and management cycle with nested levels of activity that scale down from international laws and policies to national governance issues to operational management of a fishery. Each level is connected to those above by a series of feedback loops that allow finer scale and faster moving process to be incorporated within the larger and slower levels above. More recently, FAO has promoted a management planning and implementation cycle, FAO 2003, for implementing the EAF, which unpacks the management and implementation components of the origin framework. The implementation cycle recognizes a series of steps in the management process, beginning with the scoping phase and running through the conventional steps of setting objectives, making rules, implementing management, and monitoring and assessing outcomes. Figure 1 shows the EAF implementation cycle source FAO 2003. First element is scoping. It has fishery and area stakeholders, issue identification. Next is the setting objectives. Broad goals, operational objectives, indicators, and performance measured. Formulating actions and rules. Under is legislation, regulation, and planning. Down to implementing and enforcing, monitoring, and reporting. Short-term assessments, and last is long-term policy. Each element is connected on the left side with consultation with stakeholders, cascading by systems of representation. On the right side, it is under information management, indicators, case studies, models, drivers, narratives, competencies, laws, regulations, best practices, discussion groups, portals, education, and outreach. Garcia et al. 2008 adapt the research elements of the EAF implementation cycle to the particular circumstances of SSFs in the developing world figure. The resulting integrated assessment and advisory framework again explicitly restricts itself to the assessment and advisory part of the cycle. This framework advances the previous one in that, in addition to the three classical dimensions of fisheries, ecological, social, and economic, the authors highlight the process outside domain of the fishery that need to be considered. The integrated assessment and advisory framework is complete in the sense that it contains all the elements of earlier FAO frameworks, but is also idealized. The authors make clear that investment in assessment and management must, in practice, be proportionate to the value of the fishery and appropriate to its complexity. The capacity of SSF in the developing countries to conduct assessments and to monitor and evaluate outcomes will often be severely limited. As a result, it is unlikely that many SSF, especially in the least developed countries, will have the resources to fully implement an integrated assessment process. Figure 2. Integrated Assessment and Advisory Framework, Garcia et al. 2008. These are the interconnected elements of the Figure 2, and for more info, you can visit the Module 7 on the Fish 8. An important part of the scoping exercise for any fishery will be to ensure that the assessment and management process is commensurate with the ecological, social, and economic attributes of the fishery. Andrew and colleagues 2007 proposed an implementation framework that specifically addresses the challenges presented by SSF in the least developed countries. They were motivated by the need to have a flexible framework that provide the minimum set of elements in the research and management cycle. It places greater emphasis on, first, the broader, non-sectoral drivers of the fisheries management performance and the opportunities and threats they present to people's livelihoods. The inside-looking out perspective. And second is the institutions that govern fisheries, particularly the nature and legitimacy, use rights as a central, identifiable, separate precursor to effective management. Figure 3. A general framework for diagnosis and management of SSF in the developing world external environment. We have ecological potential and constraints, economic, institutional potential and constraint, down to diagnosis and management constituency, down to management, down to outcome, social ecological configuration. Each of these approaches provides significant and unique contributions to fisheries management. More importantly, these approaches and frameworks can work together. We argue that the EAF provides the most appropriate overarching approach to the management because it is established in national and international law and policy. The greatest impediment to progress has probably been the fact that within the conventional fisheries research tradition, there has been little capacity to integrate across many dimensions ecological, social, and economic of a fisheries system. Charles 2001, Garcia, and Charles 2007. Innovation in research occurs much faster than innovation in management. If management is able to prevent the fishery from failing to deliver benefits that reduce poverty by nurturing and preserving ecological and social institutional attributes that enable it to renew and recognize itself, then these approaches to SSF are more likely to succeed than conventional approaches. Nevertheless, there remains considerable work to be done to crystallize appealing theory in the well-grounded and tested approaches and framework for analysis and policy advice. Building such as portfolio of practice in alternative SSF management is the principal challenge to reconciling the EF resilience and right-based SSF approaches.